A racist police officer forced a black man to pick up trash, accusing him of trespassing on private property, without realizing that the man was the governor of the state. When the man's true identity was revealed, it completely upended the officer's life forever. This gripping story not only exposes the abuse of power, but also ignites a powerful call for justice. But before diving into this dramatic tale, share where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. The soft morning sunlight bathed everything in a hazy golden glow, filtering through the dense foliage of the forest. Birds chirped melodiously from the high branches, accompanied by the distant hum of cicadas. A gentle breeze carried the earthy scent of damp soil and fresh greenery, infusing the air with a tranquil vitality. This was why John Carter, a 54-year-old man with streaks of silver in his hair and a sturdy frame, cherished this place. The forest felt like an old friend, always welcoming him back whenever he needed solace amid the pressures of life. John was no ordinary man. He was the governor of the state, a resolute yet compassionate leader. However, in his simple white t-shirt, faded jeans, and worn-out sneakers, no one would guess that he was the head of an entire state. For John, power had never been what he valued most. It was moments like these, immersed in nature and listening to his inner thoughts, that he truly yearned for. This was his refuge to find balance, to shed the weight of political tension, and to reconnect with his authentic self. This forest was more than just a retreat for John. It was a sacred part of his past. It was here that he and his late best friend had spent countless hours exploring every nook and cranny, climbing massive boulders, studying rare plants, and sharing their dreams. That friend had been among the first to believe in John's vision and determination to create change. When John was elected governor, that friend was the first to congratulate him and had always been there to help him keep his faith intact. But that friend was gone now, and this forest, with its towering ancient trees standing like silent sentinels, had become the place where John felt closest to his memory. Every time he walked along the familiar trails, he could almost hear the echo of laughter or see the fleeting shadow of his friend sitting beneath the giant tree they had often called their resting spot. Today was no different. John came to the forest not just to relax but also to honor his memories. Carrying a small water bottle, he strolled through the lush green canopy, savoring the cool and quiet that he always sought here. Yet, deep in his mind, a gnawing worry persisted. Recently, he had heard rumors of a massive development project targeting the forest. A real estate conglomerate was planning to transform this place into a luxury resort. To John, the idea was not only distressing, but a blatant affront to the memory and values this forest embodied. John ventured deeper into the woods. The vibrant summer sunlight, now filtered through layers of leaves, left shimmering patches of light on the forest floor. He stopped at a large tree where he and his best friend had once spent hours talking. Placing his hand on the tree's rough, cool bark, he whispered as if speaking to his old friend, "We promise to protect this place. I won't let anyone destroy it." Sitting down at the tree's base, John took a sip from his water bottle, his gaze drifting into the distance between the trunks. Closing his eyes, he tried to let his mind drift to happier memories. But a strange sound in the distance jolted him back. At first, it was just a faint noise, like the wheels of a vehicle rolling over gravel. Within seconds, the sound grew sharper. The blare of a police siren broke through the forest's tranquil silence. John opened his eyes, frowning slightly. A siren in this secluded place was unusual. The forest was under state jurisdiction, and there was no reason for such commotion here. Who would be here at this hour? he wondered, adjusting his water bottle. Walking cautiously toward the source of the sound, his earlier sense of peace was replaced by unease. Through the trees, he spotted a white patrol car with flashing lights piercing the serene natural surroundings. Two men in police uniforms stepped out. They hadn't noticed John yet, but their scrutinizing gazes and rigid postures suggested that something was amiss. John stopped, inhaling deeply. He had no idea what awaited him, but his instincts told him that this tranquil morning was about to turn into a memorable day, and not in the way he had hoped. John walked slowly through the trees, heading toward the police siren. As he drew closer, he saw two men in blue uniforms standing by a patrol car. One, likely in his mid-30s, tall with a cold, arrogant demeanor, leaned against the car door, lazily twirling a baton. The other, younger, perhaps in his early 20s, appeared uneasy, standing back as if avoiding eye contact with the world. The moment John emerged onto the trail, the older officer stepped forward, his eyes scanning John from head to toe. "Hey, you there," he shouted, his voice cutting through the forest's calm like a blade. "Stop right there." John paused, meeting the man's gaze with calm composure. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked evenly. "Problem?" The man tilted his chin up, offering a crooked, mocking smile. "You're trespassing on private property. Got a permit?" John furrowed his brow, glancing around the familiar forest. "Private property? I've been walking here for years. I've never seen any signs indicating this area is restricted." "Is that so?" The officer took another step closer, now just a few feet away. "Maybe you didn't notice, but this is private property now, and I'm here to make sure no one breaks the law." The younger officer, Adam Bailey, remained silent in the background, his eyes avoiding John's. He nervously scuffed the ground with his boot, as if silently urging his partner to ease up but lacking the courage to say it aloud. "I haven't seen any signs," John replied, his voice steady but firm. "And if this area has indeed been reclassified as private property, I would expect official notice from the state government." Mark Henderson, the older officer, sneered, gripping his baton tightly. "I don't need a lecture on the law from you," he growled, stepping even closer. "Here's the deal. Leave now, or I'll cite you for trespassing." John stood his ground, his gaze locked on Mark. "Officer, I don't want to cause trouble, but I believe I have the right to understand why this area, which is under state jurisdiction, is now being considered private property." Mark's eyes glinted with anger, the calm defiance in John's demeanor unsettling him. "Listen, old man," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "I don't care what you think. You've got two options. Turn around and leave, or I'll arrest you." John took a deep breath, striving to maintain his composure. He understood that confronting someone like Mark, whose ego outweighed his sense of duty, wouldn't get him far. But he also had no intention of backing down, especially when he knew his rights. "I'm not going anywhere," John said calmly but resolutely. "If you have evidence that I'm breaking the law, show it. Otherwise, I'll continue my walk." Mark's eyes flared with rage. John's unshakable calm seemed to challenge his authority. "Fine," Mark said, his voice laced with menace. He turned, opened the trunk of the patrol car, and pulled out a large black trash bag. "If you want to stay, you'll have to work off your violation." He threw the bag at John's feet, the sound of it hitting the ground echoing through the stillness. "Pick up all the trash along this trail," Mark ordered, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Make it spotless before I change my mind and arrest you." John looked down at the bag, then back up at Mark's gloating expression. Though a wave of indignity swept over him, he betrayed no emotion. "Officer, this isn't how you should enforce the law. John said evenly. But Mark only laughed loudly, folding his arms as he waited. From the background, Adam remained motionless, his face betraying his unease. He drew a shaky breath, as if on the verge of speaking, but ultimately stayed silent. John realized this was more than just an abuse of power. It was a test, and he knew he had to endure it, not just for himself, but to expose this injustice. With a small nod, John bent down to pick up the bag, his gaze unwavering from Mark. In his mind, the gears of strategy were already turning. "Very well," he said. "Let's see who truly needs a lesson in respecting the law." John stood up straight, gripping the trash bag Mark had thrown at him. His gaze remained calm, but tension seemed to fill the air around them. Without saying a word, he bent down and began picking up small pieces of litter from the ground. The rustling of dry leaves beneath his feet blended with the mocking laughter of Mark, who stood with his arms crossed, watching as he had just pulled off a triumphant prank. "That's right. Pick it up, old man," Mark yelled, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe this will teach you not to wander around where you're not supposed to." He stepped closer, bending slightly to meet John's face, a twisted, contemptuous grin on his lips. "Or maybe you just don't get the laws around here. Someone like you, who could say?" Mark's words, laced with prejudice, struck like a sharp dagger into John's pride. Yet, instead of retaliating, John maintained his composure. He methodically picked up each scrap of paper and every discarded can, as if he hadn't heard Mark's taunts. Still, his grip on the trash bag tightened so much that his knuckles turned white. Behind them, Adam Bailey stood frozen at a distance. His face betrayed unease and discomfort as he watched the scene unfold. Adam wasn't the type to seek confrontation, and he certainly didn't want to hurt anyone. But under Mark's command, he felt compelled to remain silent, unable to speak up. "Officer Henderson, is this really necessary?" Adam finally spoke, his voice soft but loud enough for Mark to hear. Mark turned sharply, frowning at Adam as though he'd just said something foolish. "What did you say, Bailey? This is a lesson for people who don't respect the rules. If you don't like it, why don't you sit in the car and wait?" Adam swallowed hard, unable to muster a reply. He glanced at John, the older man silently enduring the humiliating task without complaint. John's calm demeanor only deepened Adam's guilt. Still, he lacked the courage to do more than stand there silently. Mark, emboldened by Adam's inaction, seemed even more pleased with himself. He continued to hover over John, nitpicking his every move. "Hurry up. Are you planning to spend the whole day at this? Or is your old age making picking up trash such a monumental task?" He laughed loudly, his voice echoing through the quiet forest. John remained silent, but his actions, methodically collecting each piece of trash and tying the bag securely, demonstrated his unyielding determination. He refused to let humiliation break his resolve. In his mind, a plan to confront Mark was already forming. This wasn't just a petty incident. It symbolized something much larger, the abuse of power and injustice that needed to be exposed. As the trash bag grew heavier, Mark barked another order. "Hey, I think you missed a piece over there." He pointed to a spot farther away, the malicious grin never leaving his face. "Go pick it up. I don't want to see this place left a mess." John looked up at Mark, his eyes steady and unwavering. His gaze seemed to deliver a silent message. "You will pay for this." Yet he said nothing, merely nodding slightly before walking toward the spot Mark had indicated. Meanwhile, Adam watched John, his emotions torn. The injustice of the situation was glaringly obvious to him, but he didn't know how to stop Mark's behavior. As the sun rose higher, its heat growing more intense, Sweat trickled down John's brow and soaked the back of his shirt. But his calm demeanor never wavered. He continued the humiliating task, his unshaken attitude aggravating Mark further. "Trying to act noble, are you?" Mark growled, stepping closer. "I don't know who you think you are, but don't for a second believe that attitude is going to faze me. I can make things a lot worse for you, do you understand?" John remained still, his gaze so composed that it made Mark visibly uneasy. At that moment, Adam took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage he had. "Officer Henderson, I think we should stop. It seems like this has gone too far." Mark spun around, narrowing his eyes at Adam. "Bailey, are you trying to tell me how to do my job? If you don't like how I handle things, why don't you go ahead and turn in your badge?" Adam hung his head, saying nothing further. But deep down, guilt was rising like a tide. Meanwhile, John bent down again, tying the now full trash bag securely. His eyes, sharp and knowing, seemed to pierce into both Mark and Adam's very cores. He knew today wouldn't end here. This injustice would not go unanswered. As the trash bag grew heavier and the summer sun blazed hotter, John felt sweat beading on his forehead and soaking through his shirt. His body was weary, but his mind had never been clearer. Mark's taunts and Adam's awkward silence did nothing to unsettle him. Instead, each step along the familiar trail took him back through memories, reminders of the struggles he had overcome to become the man he was today. John thought of his childhood in a small southern town where racial segregation pervaded every aspect of life. As the son of working-class parents, he grew up in a world where crossing into a white street could invite threats, or worse, violence. He had watched his father, a railroad worker, endure verbal abuse simply for daring to hold his head high while speaking to his boss. His mother, a strong but weary woman burdened by societal prejudice, would always caution him before he left the house. "Keep your head down. Stay quiet. Don't give them a reason to hurt you." But John was not one to bow easily. From a young age, he recognized the injustice around him, and it ignited a fierce desire for change. Yet change was never easy. As a high school student, John faced ridicule from his peers. Once, he was shoved to the ground in the schoolyard while a group of boys laughed at him for daring to join the debate team, a privilege they believed no black boy should have. Rather than give up, John resolved to prove them wrong. He spent hours reading and practicing his speeches in the small mirror of his cramped bedroom. Eventually, at a school competition, he defeated every opponent and claimed the top spot. It was the first time John understood the power of words and determination. Life, however, was not all triumphs. When he entered college, John worked 2 part-time jobs to cover tuition. He remembered long nights waiting tables at a local diner, enduring rude customers who either yelled at him or ignored him altogether because of his skin color. John never responded, but each encounter etched a new reason in his heart never to give up. As an adult, John became a teacher in an underserved community. He encountered hundreds of children grappling with challenges similar to his own. More than just teaching, John became a mentor, a protector, and an inspiration. He taught them that no one had the right to define their worth except themselves. It was at this school that John first gained the community's recognition. They saw him not just as a teacher, but as a leader, someone who could transform lives. Running for governor was no easy feat. When John entered politics, he faced numerous obstacles and opposition. Rivals dug into his past, attempting to smear him. Whispers spread that someone like him could never win in a conservative state. But John stood firm, speaking the truth and focusing on core values: justice, equality, and hope. With the support of his community and his unwavering resolve, he eventually triumphed. Returning to the present, John paused momentarily, looking up through the trees at the sky. Rays of sunlight streamed through the leaves like faint beacons of hope in the darkness he once clung to. These memories didn't weaken him. Instead, they reminded him that this wasn't his first confrontation with injustice, and it wouldn't be the last. Looking down at the nearly full trash bag, John tightened his grip on it. He knew Mark likely saw him as a weak old man, a victim unable to resist. But Mark didn't know that small battles like this were the fuel for John's strength. He had been mocked, humiliated, and oppressed. And yet, he had always risen, always won. "You're so slow, old man," Mark's voice snapped, pulling John back to the present. His tone was still dripping with smugness and arrogance. John didn't respond. Instead, he bent down again to pick up another piece of trash, his gaze steady and full of resolve. In his heart, he made a silent vow. Things will change, Mark Henderson, but not in the way you expect. John had just bent down to pick up a candy wrapper when the sound of light but purposeful footsteps echoed from deep within the forest. He raised his head, his gaze shifting toward the noise, and saw a figure approaching. It was Michael Grant, the regional forest ranger, a sturdy, middle-aged man dressed in the distinctive green uniform and wide-brimmed hat of his profession. His face was calm, but his sharp eyes exuded the confidence of someone familiar with both the forest and human nature. Mark Henderson turned as well, frowning when he saw Michael approach. "Who are you?" Mark asked, his tone unfriendly. Michael stopped, his assessing gaze moving from Mark to John, and finally to Adam, who stood awkwardly in the background. "I'm Michael Grant, the regional ranger for this area," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I'm responsible for overseeing and protecting this forest. And you, officer, what are you doing here?" Mark smirked and crossed his arms. "I'm doing my job. This man," he said, gesturing toward John, "has trespassed on private property. I'm teaching him to respect the law." Michael raised an eyebrow, his gaze lingering on Mark as if gauging the seriousness of the situation. "Private property?" he asked, his voice cold. "You're mistaken, officer. This forest is under state jurisdiction, not private ownership. It's public land, designated for government and citizen use." Michael's response made Mark hesitate for a moment, but he quickly masked his discomfort with a smug smirk. "Are you sure about that, Ranger?" Mark said, trying to maintain his air of authority. "Because I've been informed that this area has been converted to private property, and this man has no right to be here." Michael stared at Mark, his gaze unwavering. "I don't know where you got your information," he said, his tone calm but firm. "But I know the law and the administrative boundaries here, and I can assure you this land remains under state management. Unless you can produce documents proving otherwise, I suggest you cease your abuse of authority." Mark clenched his jaw, clearly displeased at being challenged in front of both his subordinate and John. His confidence wavered slightly, but instead of admitting fault, he doubled down with aggression. "Abuse of authority? I'm doing my job," he snapped, stepping closer to Michael. "I don't need a ranger like you telling me how to do it." Michael didn't back down. He stood tall, his eyes resolute. "Your job is to protect and enforce the law, not to humiliate others, and I will not stand by while you exceed your authority, Officer Henderson." John observed the entire exchange with a contemplative gaze. He said nothing, but Michael's arrival gave him a sense of relief. Deep down, John knew Michael was more than just an ordinary ranger. He was someone who upheld justice and, more importantly, wasn't afraid to confront individuals like Mark who abused their power. Adam, standing further back, seemed increasingly uneasy. He darted glances between Mark, Michael, and John. It was clear that Adam could sense the stark difference between Mark's aggression and Michael's calm assertiveness. Yet he remained silent, unwilling to intervene. Sensing the resolve in Michael's tone, Mark finally relented a little. "Fine," he said begrudgingly. "If you're so sure this is public land, I'll leave, but don't think you can stop me from doing my job." Michael didn't reply immediately. He simply gave Mark a measured look before turning to John. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, his tone respectful. John gave a slight nod, his calm smile unwavering. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied, his gaze resting on Michael, silently expressing his gratitude. Mark spun around abruptly, clearly eager to end the conversation. "Bailey, let's go," he barked, his tone curt. But before leaving, he shot Michael a venomous glare. "Don't think this is over." Michael watched him leave without a word. As Mark and Adam's footsteps faded into the forest, the tranquil atmosphere seemed to return. Yet both John and Michael knew this was far from the end of the matter. Michael turned back to John, offering a faint smile. "You handled that well," he said. "Staying calm in such a situation is no easy task." John returned the smile. "Sometimes calmness is the strongest weapon," he replied, his eyes alight with determination. "But I'm certain this is only the beginning." Mark and Adam had barely started walking away when Mark's footsteps suddenly halted. It seemed as though he was reconsidering something. He turned his head, his eyes flaring with anger as he noticed John still standing tall, the heavy trash bag in his hand and his composure unshaken. The perceived challenge to his authority was something Mark couldn't ignore. "Wait a minute," Mark barked, his voice loud and abrasive, prompting both Michael and John to turn around. Mark strode quickly back toward them, placing himself squarely between the two men, his expression brimming with hostility. "You think this is over so easily, Ranger? You think a few words are enough to make me leave?" Michael narrowed his eyes, his face still calm, but now bearing an edge of steely resolve. "Officer Henderson, I've made myself clear. This area is under state jurisdiction. Mr. Carter has broken no laws. I suggest you return to your vehicle and leave before you make matters worse." But Mark didn't budge. Instead, he sneered and pointed at John. "This old man isn't done yet," he said mockingly. "He's still got trash to pick up unless he wants me to take him to the station." John remained silent, his sharp gaze fixed on Mark without any sign of fear or submission. Yet Mark's frustration seemed to grow in the absence of a reaction. "Listen here, old man," Mark said, stepping closer, his hand gripping his baton tightly. "I don't care who you think you are or what you think you're doing. If you don't finish cleaning this trail, I'll arrest you for obstructing an officer." Michael immediately stepped forward, positioning himself protectively in front of John. His voice was cold but precise. "Officer Henderson, I suggest you carefully consider your words and actions. Mr. Carter has committed no violation, and I will repeat, you have no authority to compel him to do anything." Mark flinched slightly at Michael's firmness, but instead of backing down, he escalated his aggression. He pulled his baton from its holster, swinging it lightly as an implicit threat. "Watch your words, Ranger," he said, his tone hard. "This is my job, and you have no right to interfere." Adam, standing farther away, seemed almost paralyzed. He stared at the scene, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. It was clear that he disagreed with Mark's behavior, but fear of confrontation kept him silent. "That's enough, Mark," Adam suddenly shouted, his voice trembling but filled with newfound determination. Both Michael and John turned to look at him, surprise evident in their eyes. It was the first time Adam had dared to speak out. Mark whipped around, his eyes blazing with anger. "What did you say, Bailey?" he snarled, stepping toward Adam. "Whose side are you on?" Adam took a step back, still visibly nervous, but he held his ground. I think we've gone too far. This man hasn't done anything wrong. He doesn't deserve to be treated like this." Mark laughed bitterly, though it was devoid of any real humor. "Bailey, I'll pretend I didn't hear that. But if you ever interfere with me again, you'll regret it." Michael stepped forward, cutting off the confrontation. "Officer Henderson, you should stop before you destroy your career. Remember, your actions and words today could be reported directly to your superiors." Mark turned back to Michael, his anger reaching its boiling point. But instead of escalating further, he tightened his grip on his baton, letting out a frustrated sigh. "Fine," he growled, his eyes still glaring at John, "but don't think this is over." He spun on his heel and signaled Adam to follow. Adam hesitated, glancing back at John with an apologetic expression before reluctantly trailing after Mark. As their figures disappeared into the forest, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate. Michael turned to John, his expression filled with respect. "Are you all right?" John nodded and offered a faint smile. "I'm fine, but I think this is only the beginning." Michael was silent for a moment before nodding in agreement. "We'll make sure what happened today doesn't go unnoticed. I'll stand as a witness if needed." John smiled again, but in his eyes a powerful resolve was taking shape. He knew this was about more than a single incident. It was about exposing injustice, rooting out abuse of power, and laying the foundation for systemic change. When the silhouettes of Mark and Adam disappeared among the trees, John felt as if a weight had lifted off his shoulders. He continued picking up litter along the trail, but Mark's words kept echoing in his mind. "This is private property." That phrase churned repeatedly in his head. John knew this forest well. It was state-managed, and there had never been an official announcement of ownership change. Yet Mark's attitude, paired with his unusual aggression, made it impossible for John to dismiss the feeling that something suspicious was underway. John stepped over a large tree stump, gripping his heavy trash bag tightly. As he bent down to pick up a piece of paper wedged under some dry leaves, a faint glint caught his eye. Sunlight pierced through the canopy and reflected off something buried deeper in the foliage. The object glimmered just enough to grab his attention. John paused, carefully brushing away the leaves and twigs to reveal an old, rolled-up piece of paper, tied with a frayed rubber band. He picked up the roll, feeling its rough texture in his hands. The paper was yellowed, its edges slightly torn but still intact. When John unrolled it, a detailed map came into view. It was a map of the forest with familiar trails marked. However, something was amiss. Large areas were circled in red ink, accompanied by small handwritten notes. At the bottom corner of the map, a bold phrase stood out: "Luxury Resort Development Project, Survey Phase." John frowned. His heartbeat quickened as he scanned the map. Notes beside the circled areas mentioned land clearing, geological analysis, and even deforestation planning. Most strikingly, in one corner of the map, he spotted the name of a corporation he had heard about in recent government meetings: Red Line Development Group. John sat down on a nearby stump, his eyes fixed on the map. He recalled recent rumors suggesting that this forest might be sold to a private corporation for commercial development. Yet, the state government had issued no formal statement, and as governor, John knew any significant change like this would require his approval. The presence of this map, however, told a completely different story. Every handwritten note seemed to unravel a much larger conspiracy. John scrutinized the details, finding information about proposed infrastructure sites from parking lots to villa zones. Some areas were marked priority clearing, matching locations where he had recently seen survey markers in the forest. At that moment, John remembered Mark's aggressive demeanor. He knows something, John thought. He wasn't here by coincidence. Mark didn't strike him as someone naturally inclined to protect this area. Yet his confrontational attitude suggested he was carrying out orders from someone powerful. John's throat felt dry. He realized the map wasn't just an old discarded piece of paper. It was evidence of a meticulously hidden plan, a plan that could jeopardize the forest and the values it represented. Quickly, John rolled the map back up and carefully tucked it into his inner jacket pocket. If you were John Carter in this situation, what would you do? Would you keep the discovery secret to investigate further, or make it public immediately to stop the threat? Share your thoughts in the comments below. John glanced around cautiously, his gaze sharp as though he feared being watched. Michael, the forest ranger, stood not far away, his attentive eyes scanning the surroundings. Still, John decided to say nothing about his discovery. His political instincts told him this situation required delicate handling. One small mistake, and the map could disappear, or worse, be used against him. "Governor Carter, is everything all right?" Michael asked, noticing John lingering longer than usual. John looked up, masking his thoughts with a calm smile. "No, nothing's wrong," he replied steadily. "Just lost in thought." Michael nodded, satisfied. "I imagine you've got big plans for this place," he said. "Let me know if there's any way I can help." John thanked Michael with a nod, but inside, his mind was racing. "I need to find out what Redline Development Group is up to and what they're targeting. If this is a plot to seize this forest, I won't let them succeed." John resumed picking up litter along the trail, but the map in his pocket now felt heavier than its weight suggested. Every step he took amplified the sense of responsibility pressing down on him. This was no longer just about him or a single forest. It was a fight to uphold justice, prevent abuse of power, and protect the values he believed in. For now, he needed more information. But deep down, John knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let this forest fall victim to greed. This is where I'll stand my ground, and this is where I'll prevail. The roar of engines interrupted the forest's calm, growing louder with every passing second. John turned his head to see headlights piercing through the trees, their beams illuminating the trail ahead. Moments later, a sleek black SUV rolled into view, its polished surface gleaming in the sunlight. The vehicle stopped a short distance from John, its presence radiating an air of mystery and authority. Nearby, Mark, who had been near his patrol vehicle, straightened up as the SUV arrived. He scowled, visibly irritated. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, striding toward the vehicle with suspicion. Adam, standing beside him, looked at the SUV with a mix of anxiety and curiosity. The SUV's front door opened, and a tall, sharp-dressed man in a black suit stepped out. He exuded precision and seriousness, his tie impeccably knotted. The rear door opened next, revealing another man similarly dressed. The two scanned the area before their eyes settled on John. Their expressions immediately shifted to one of respect. The second man approached John, bowing his head slightly, and spoke in a calm yet authoritative tone. "Governor, are you all right?" The words cut through the tranquil forest like thunder. Mark froze in place, his wide eyes betraying his shock. Adam, too, stood paralyzed, his mouth moving as though to speak, but no words came out. "Governor," Mark stammered, his voice cracking. He turned to look at John, seeking confirmation for what he had just heard. But John remained composed. his gaze steady on the two men from the SUV, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I'm fine," John replied calmly but firmly. "Thank you for coming." The man in the suit nodded and approached John with deference. "We were informed you were in the area. When we heard about the situation, we came immediately to ensure your safety." John gave a slight nod, understanding their presence was not just to protect him, but to illuminate the unfolding situation. Meanwhile, Mark stood rooted to the spot, his previous arrogance now completely stripped away. Adam looked as though he wished to vanish into thin air. His gaze darted between John and Mark, his face etched with fear and regret. The realization that the man they had antagonized was the state's governor left him visibly shaken. Mark finally found his voice, though it trembled. You're the governor?" he asked, struggling to maintain composure but failing miserably. John turned and walked slowly toward Mark. Standing tall, he looked Mark directly in the eye. "Yes," he said, his tone measured but cold. "I am John Carter, the governor of this state." The words carried the weight of judgment, leaving Mark to step back instinctively. His lips moved as if to offer an excuse, but he remained silent, fully aware of the gravity of his actions. John held Mark's gaze, his expression calm yet unyielding. "Officer Henderson," he said slowly, each word cutting through the silence like a knife. "I trust you understand the consequences of your behavior today." Mark stammered, fumbling for words. "Sir, I didn't know. I was just doing my job." John raised a hand to silence him. "No excuses," he said firmly. "Your actions will be investigated, and the truth will come to light." The man in the suit behind John stepped forward, his voice firm and authoritative. "Officer Henderson, you and your colleague will need to provide a full report on today's actions. Everything has been documented, and the necessary steps will be taken." Adam took a deep breath, as though he had just escaped a nightmare. He bowed his head, remaining silent, but the regret in his eyes was unmistakable. John cast one last look at the two officers before turning to the two suited men. "Let's go," he said, his tone calm, yet imbued with undeniable strength. As the black SUV prepared to pull away, John suddenly signaled the driver to stop. The door opened and he stepped out, his eyes fixed on Mark, who was still frozen in place near the patrol car. Adam, standing a step behind, looked as though he wished to vanish into thin air. But Mark's expression was a chaotic blend of fear and confusion. He seemed torn between fleeing and staying to face whatever was coming. John walked toward him slowly, each step exuding a calm yet commanding presence, as though every movement affirmed the authority he wielded. When he was only a few steps away, he stopped. His eyes bore into Mark's, not with anger, not with menace, but with the gravity of someone who had witnessed far too much injustice. "Mark Henderson," John began, his voice low and deliberate, every word hanging in the air between them. "You have crossed the line, and you will be held accountable for what you did today." Mark stepped back, sweat streaming down his forehead. Governor," he stammered, struggling to regain his composure. I didn't know who you were. I was just doing my job. I didn't mean—" "Didn't mean?" John interrupted, his voice sharp yet calm, like a blade cutting through Mark's feeble excuse. "You think abusing your authority, insulting others, and coercing them into unreasonable actions is just part of your job?" Mark swallowed hard, his eyes darting around as he searched for a justification. I thought you were trespassing. I didn't know this area was under state jurisdiction. If I had known, I wouldn't have." His sentence trailed off, realizing that no excuse could absolve him of his actions. John took another step forward, now standing just an arm's length away. "You don't need to know who I am to understand that your actions were wrong," he said, his voice deep and resolute. "The person you mistreat could be anyone, a regular citizen, a child, or even someone without a home. Every act like this not only harms them but erodes the community's trust in people like you." Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. John's presence was too overwhelming, making any defense seem futile. "You chose to use your authority to intimidate and abuse rather than protect," John continued, his gaze unwavering, "and I promise you, today will not end without consequences. I will personally oversee the investigation into your actions." Mark trembled, his eyes shifting from fear to desperation. "Please, Governor," he pleaded, his voice weak and almost inaudible. I have a family to support. I didn't mean to. I was just doing what I thought was right." John remained still, unmoved by the plea. "Right?" he asked, his tone cold and firm. "If this is what you consider right, then you no longer deserve to wear that uniform." Mark hung his head, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of John's words had crushed him. He knew there was no escape from the consequences he now faced. Behind him, Adam Bailey stood awkwardly, no longer hiding his discomfort. He looked at Mark, then at John, a mix of guilt and respect washing over him. He realized his silence had made him complicit, and that, too, was part of the problem. John turned to Adam, his expression softening. "You're young, Officer Bailey," he said. "There's still time for you to make things right, but that starts with deciding what kind of person you want to be." Adam nodded slowly, unable to speak. Inside, he made a silent promise. He would not repeat today's mistakes. John turned back to Mark for a final word. "I will ensure that today's events are brought to light," he said, his voice as sharp as a blade. "And I hope, if you are ever given a second chance, you will learn to honor your responsibilities." As John prepared to leave, his eyes lingered on Adam Bailey, who remained frozen in place. The young officer kept his head bowed, unable to meet anyone's gaze. His hands clenched into fists, as though struggling to hold on to the last threads of composure. John pivoted and walked toward Adam, the surrounding air seeming to still as their eyes met. Adam's filled with unease, John's with the weight of unspoken truth. Adam didn't move, but his entire body trembled, and his eyes darted away from John's penetrating gaze. "Bailey," John called his name, his voice steady yet commanding. "I've seen the look in your eyes since this began. You know what happened today was wrong, don't you?" Adam glanced up briefly before bowing his head again. "Yes, sir," he admitted, his voice trembling. He took a deep breath, trying to gather his courage. "I know." John stepped closer, narrowing the distance between them. "Then why were you silent?" he asked, his tone not accusatory but firm. "Why did you stand there, watching Mark Henderson's actions, and say nothing?" Adam raised his head, his eyes filled with remorse. I didn't know what to do," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I was scared. I was afraid if I spoke up, Mark would turn on me, or worse, I'd lose my job. This job is all I have." John paused, studying Adam closely as though looking into his very soul. "Bailey," he said slowly, "I understand fear. I know standing up against injustice, especially when it comes from someone beside you, isn't easy. But let me tell you this. Staying silent in the face of wrongdoing is the same as enabling it. And when you stay silent, you're not just betraying the people you're sworn to protect, you're betraying yourself." Adam bit his lip, his shoulders sagging. John's words struck deep, stirring emotions he could no longer suppress. He bowed his head deeply, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his eyes closing against the shame. "I was wrong. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to." John placed a hand on Adam's shoulder, the touch light but meaningful. "You're young, Bailey," he said, his tone gentler now. "You still have the chance to change. But that change must start with you. Ask yourself, what kind of officer do you want to be? One who uses their power to oppress, or one who stands for justice and truth?" Adam nodded, his eyes now reflecting a glimmer of determination. "I want to stand for justice, sir," he said, his voice stronger. "I promise I'll never stay silent like I did today. I'll do what's right, no matter how hard it is." John gave a faint smile, withdrawing his hand and nodding. "Good," he said. "Remember your promise. Let today be the lesson that shapes your future, and if you need help, don't hesitate to reach out to me." Adam nodded again, gratitude shining in his eyes. He knew he had been given a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it. John turned and walked back to the waiting SUV. As the door closed and the vehicle pulled away, Adam stood there, watching until it disappeared behind the trees. He took a deep breath, feeling as though a great weight had been lifted. Deep inside, he resolved that from this moment on, he would be a better man, a man worthy of the responsibility he had chosen. In the distance, Mark Henderson remained rooted in place, his face pale and expressionless. But for Adam, this marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chance to make amends and make a difference. The next day, the tranquil forest of the previous day became the center of attention across the state. A video capturing the entire incident went viral on social media, garnering millions of views within hours. One of Governor John Carter's staff members, who accompanied him on his visit to the forest, had secretly recorded the scene of Mark Henderson abusing his authority, insulting, and threatening the governor without knowing his identity. The footage of Mark forcing John to pick up trash, his derogatory remarks, and the climactic moment when Mark realized he was confronting the governor sparked widespread outrage across online platforms. Headlines exploded in the news. "Officer abuses power," "Insults governor in the woods," "How much abuse of power is enough," and "A lesson for those who cross the line with authority." That morning, a statement from the police department announced that Mark Henderson had been immediately suspended and placed under internal investigation. The department's leaders pledged to handle the case with strict measures if serious violations were found. However, the public demanded more than an internal review. They wanted justice. Social advocacy groups called for transparency throughout the investigation process, insisting there be no cover-up of Henderson's abuses. Mark, who once exuded confidence in his authority, became a symbol of the misuse of power. The media relentlessly criticized him, and former colleagues began sharing stories about his aggressive demeanor and unethical behavior in the past. Meanwhile, Governor John Carter refused to let the incident fade as an isolated case. In a special press conference held at the state government building, he appeared calm, yet resolute. Before dozens of cameras and reporters, he recounted the events in the forest, not to draw attention to himself, but to address two critical issues he sought to tackle. "This is not about me," John stated, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "This is about every citizen in this state. Those without titles or power to protect themselves when they face abuse of authority. People like Mark Henderson not only tarnish the image of law enforcement, but also erode the public's trust in the very system meant to protect them." His words were met with resounding applause. He continued by calling for police reforms, emphasizing the need for greater accountability, enhanced training in ethics and conflict resolution, and the establishment of independent oversight mechanisms. In addition to pushing for law enforcement reform, John used this opportunity to shed light on a larger conspiracy. During the press conference, he publicly revealed the map he had discovered in the forest, explaining that it was evidence of an illegal resort development project spearheaded by Redline Development Group. This map is a reminder that it's not only people but also our natural resources that are under threat from greed and irresponsibility, he said. The forest we hold dear is not a commodity to be bought, sold, and destroyed. It is a part of our heritage, a treasure we must protect for future generations. His message ignited a spark among the public. Numerous environmental groups, social activists, and even small businesses voiced their support for him. A new movement emerged, not only to protect the forest but to advocate for more sustainable development policies across the state. In the meantime, Mark Henderson faced mounting isolation and pressure. His colleagues began distancing themselves, his family was hounded by the media, and he was repeatedly summoned for questioning to explain his actions. Both his career and reputation were utterly destroyed. Mark's downfall served as a stark lesson not only for those in law enforcement, but for anyone in positions of power. It reminded everyone that power is not a tool for oppression, but a responsibility to protect. Through this incident, Governor John Carter became more than a leader. He became a symbol of the fight for justice and environmental protection. He used the momentum from the event to champion significant reforms, from preserving natural resources to ensuring no citizen would be treated unjustly. In the weeks that followed, the forest once again returned to the peaceful sanctuary it had always been. Yet now, it was more than just a forest. It had become a symbol of unity, a testament to a community that came together to defend justice and protect their shared environment. And for John Carter, he knew this battle was only the beginning. But he was ready to continue because he believed that justice was never just an abstract concept. It was action, responsibility, and something that everyone deserved to receive. As public outrage over the forest incident continued to simmer, Governor John Carter did not stop at condemning abuse of power. Instead, he transformed the community's anger into momentum for sweeping change. 1 week after the event, he convened a special conference at the state government building, attended by lawmakers, community representatives, and social advocacy groups. At the conference, John unveiled an ambitious series of reforms aimed at addressing both systemic policing issues and environmental protection. He called it the Justice and Sustainability Initiative, a comprehensive plan that included police reform, mandatory training on professional ethics, conflict resolution, and bias reduction, establishment of an independent oversight committee, including community members, to monitor cases of abuse of power, strengthening accountability with strict penalties for misconduct, environmental protection, enacting legislation to safeguard forests and other critical natural areas from unauthorized commercial development, enhancing environmental impact assessment procedures, and ensuring transparency so citizens can monitor projects, launching reforestation and wildlife conservation campaigns, with the forest at the center of the incident serving as the flagship symbol. The forest, once the site of injustice, was officially designated as a protected reserve, now named the Carter Justice Preserve. The name honored the governor and emphasized the values of justice and unity that the forest had come to represent. On the preserve's inauguration day, thousands of people from across the state gathered to participate. They carried banners with messages like "Justice for All" and "Protect Nature, Protect Our Future." Standing on a wooden platform beneath the forest's largest ancient tree, John addressed the crowd. We have seen how greed can threaten even a place as serene as this forest, he said, his voice resonating through the tranquil surroundings. But we have also proven that when we stand together, we can protect what is most precious. This forest is not just a symbol of nature. It is a symbol of our will and our fight for justice. John Carter's story quickly spread beyond the state, becoming a source of inspiration for many across the country. Those who had experienced injustice found hope in the way he faced adversity, not with anger or vengeance, but with calm, wisdom, and decisive action. Articles, books, and even documentaries were produced about the forest incident and the reforms it inspired. Similar movements began to take root in other states, with communities calling for police reform and stronger environmental protections. John received letters from across the nation, ranging from students eager to start environmental projects to older citizens thanking him for reminding them that change is always possible. In a television interview, when asked what lesson he took away from the incident, John replied slowly but with profound meaning. Injustice can happen to anyone, anywhere. But the important thing is not how we are treated, it's how we respond. Calmness, wisdom, and determination are the most powerful weapons against injustice. And if we act with unity, there is nothing that cannot be changed. As the forest settled back into its natural tranquility, it became more than a retreat into nature. It became a living testament to the strength of human will. John Carter continued his work, not just as a governor, but as a symbol of fairness and the protection of enduring values. He knew that new challenges would always arise, but he faced them without fear. He believed that as long as people held on to justice and unity, every adversity could be turned into an opportunity for change. The story of Governor John Carter and the forest reminds us that in every challenge, calmness, wisdom, and determination can transform injustice into an opportunity for change. What would you do if you were in John Carter's position? Would you stand up for justice, even in the face of abuse of power? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to help spread more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.